Good morning, everybody. I'm excited to present to you today the content of the first chapter of my thesis here at Borderlands Research Institute, and that is specifically comparing the habitat selection of aoudad, desert bighorn sheep, and mule deer in a co-occupied landscape. So for the sake of context, desert bighorn sheep and mule deer have both experienced episodes of population and range decline in Texas. Fortunately, restoration efforts beginning in the 50s and 60s have returned these two species to what can be considered historic context. Unfortunately, about the same time these restoration efforts began, the Texas wildlife scene was experiencing a new change, one that would eventually threaten the long-term success of desert bighorn and mule deer conservation. That change was the introduction of the non-native aoudad into the Texas Panhandle. Beginning in the mid-1900s, aoudad were introduced into locations in southwestern North America as well as in Europe. They were introduced specifically to the Texas Panhandle in the 1950s. Now, if you were to talk to an aoudad that was introduced to Texas in the 50s, he would probably think that he was introduced into the Garden of Eden. These aoudad have demonstrated a remarkable degree of adaptability to Texas landscapes and have subsequently exploded in population and range size since. The expansion of aoudad across the Texas Trans-Pecos has stimulated concern regarding potential conflict with our native species. Aoudad display strong physiological similarities with desert bighorn sheep and mule deer. Also, there are strong similarities in their native range. This leads us to believe that there is potentially niche overlap between these three species. So, why are we concerned with niche overlap? Well, what I'm showing you here is a one-dimensional look at the niches of three different species. And this is one-dimensional in that it is from the perspective of a single resource. The distributions you see here represent niche breadth of these three species. Okay, we see that species A and species B are overlapping in niche, or therefore overlapping in resource use. So this overlap can be directly translated in overlap in use for that particular resource. And in the event, let's consider species A to be bighorn and species B to be aoudad. In this scenario, if they're using the same resource, they're likely competing for that resource. To make matters worse, we have some anecdotal information to suggest that aoudad would be the superior competitor in this situation, therefore winning in a fight for that resource, and therefore reducing desert bighorn sheep survival in situations in which this is the case. So that is why we are concerned with niche overlap. So niche is a fairly abstract concept. How are we going to go about estimating it? I want to start by defining the broad concept of what a fundamental niche is. I want I want you to think about bighorn sheep across its geographic range. I'm talking about Rocky Mountain bighorns, desert bighorns, all of them. The fundamental niche of bighorn sheep at that scale represents all combination of resource tolerances in which that species persists. So across its geographic range of bighorn sheep operates within this range of elevation values, this range of shrub cover values, this range of temperature values, etc. The combination of those makes up its fundamental niche. Now, when you start looking at bighorn sheep at a smaller scale, let's say populations of bighorn across its geographic range, at that population scale, you will find that individuals of these populations are often not granted a favorable combination of required resources, those defined by their broad fundamental niche. In these situations, those populations of bighorn sheep have to modify their behavior to maintain survivability in that given landscape. So they have to make these trade-off decisions in which they must prioritize resource use given what they know they need and given what they know is available to them on the landscape. The term used to describe this phenomena is functional response, the change in resource use as a function of resource availability. Since functional responses describe a change in habitat use, they therefore describe the manner in which a species' broad fundamental niche is modified or compressed at smaller spatial scales. This compressed niche space is known as a realized niche, and it better represents the niche associations of a population of individuals at much smaller spatial scales. It is this realized niche that we are actually interested in estimating. We are doing this using a novel application of habitat selection analyses. Now, traditionally, habitat selection analyses provide us with inference regarding the manner in which a population of a given species selects from various habitat resources. The key feature of habitat selection analyses that allow us to make niche level inference is that they account for the availability of a given resource. This enables us to compare selection strength for certain habitat resources with the availability of that given resource. Therefore, our population level habitat selection results can represent the functional response of a given species in a given study area. Since we are able to estimate functional responses of a population of individuals, we are therefore able to estimate their respective realized niche breadth as well. When applied to aoudad, desert bighorn, and mule deer, we can then compare niche breadth and identify if niche overlap is present and for what resources is there an overlap in expected use. This leads us to the objectives of my project, which are broadly to A, compare niche breadth between these three species in terms of selection, and B, identify areas of niche overlap. From there, we'll be able to identify for what resources there is an overlap in expected use. We'll be able to find those resources on the landscape to identify where competitive battlegrounds could potentially occur on the landscape. And we'll be able to identify where refuge niche space is for these three species, given that they're able to compress their niche space to avoid competition. I'll talk more about that in the discussion at the very end. So to get into the specifics of the methodology of this project, GPS collar data makes up the bulk of our data set. We are using light track Iridium 420s manufactured by Low-Tech. We had 3 different capture events in which we deployed collars. We had one in January and May of 2019 and another in January 2020. At these captures, we collared 41 aoudad, 45 desert bighorn, and 59 mule deer. Now, data collection for this project is still underway. Therefore, the analyses I'm about to present to you represent a subset of data collected thus far. It's going to represent a single individual of each species that was alive throughout the duration of 2020. All 3 are females. The aoudad and bighorn female are 2 years old, and the mule deer female is 3 years old. These individuals were captured, collared, and released in the Van Horn Mountains of Texas. The Van Horn Mountains offer a beautiful opportunity to investigate the relationships between aoudad, desert bighorn sheep, and mule deer because all 3 of them coexist in this mountain range. With regard to the analyses, we will be estimating habitat selection using integrated step selection functions. Now, integrated step selection functions modify traditional habitat selection analyses by accounting for animal movement capacities when defining available resources. In this step selection function model, we are going to estimate the selection strength for 4 different covariates, those being slope, ruggedness, represented by the vector ruggedness measure, which is an index, as well as shrub cover and aspect. Now, our global model is going to include 2 interaction terms, one between slope and ruggedness and one between slope and shrub cover. I also want to point out that the aspect covariate, or the aspect term in this model, is actually represented with a sine and cosine term as to linearize what would otherwise be a circular variable. We will then use AIC to determine the model of best fit across each individual species. We'll take that top model's selection coefficients and create a habitat kernel using them. We can then find the product of each of those 3 independent habitat kernels to create a habitat/niche overlap kernel that's going to project niche overlap across the landscape. Now, getting into some results of these preliminary analyses. Here are our AIC tables of our combination of models that we fit. Now, the details of these AIC tables are not that important. What I do need to convey, however, is that the top model for every single species conveniently was the same model. It was our global model, the one that included 2 interaction terms between slope and ruggedness and slope and shrub cover. Here are my habitat kernels. You can think of these as habitat suitability maps in which the darker areas represent higher quality habitat. Keep in mind still that this data represents a single individual of each species, all 3 of which were females. It appears as if our mule deer female had a more generalized selection coefficients associated with the covariates included in this model, therefore experiences more generalized habitat use. Between aoudad and bighorn sheep, it seems as though they select very similar habitat, which could be indicative of some niche overlap between these two females and between these two populations. If anything, aoudad do demonstrate a more generalized use of what would be bighorn habitat. When you find the product of the habitat kernels in the previous slide, we get what we have here. And these represent overlaps between those habitat kernels. You can interpret the darker areas in these maps as areas in which there is most likely to be interaction between the two species involved for that respective map. So if there is competition present, i.e. they are competing for a series of resources, this is where those resources are located. Therefore, these are the areas in which you can expect to see a high degree of competitive interaction between these three species. Now, in the aoudad and bighorn map, I want to notice that, or I want to point out that the darkest areas of this map also correspond with the highest quality habitat modeled in the bighorn kernel from the previous slide. Therefore, we are seeing that where bighorn are happiest on the landscape could potentially also be where they would face the strongest amount of competitive pressure from aoudad. So again, these are preliminary analyses that represent a subset of what is a much larger data set. So it begs the question, what can we infer from these results? The answer is effectively nothing. This small subset of our data does not provide us with any useful level of inference. What these results do demonstrate, however, is the direction we are taking this project and the product you can expect from these results in the near future. And that is, to bring us back around, to estimate population level niche breadth between these three species. So I showed you this plot earlier depicting a one-dimensional view of niche breadth and overlap between these three species. We will end up creating plots like this for aoudad, desert bighorn sheep, and mule deer, but they will be modified to consider niche overlap across multiple resources simultaneously. To elaborate, I've added another dimension to this plot to now represent a two-dimensional niche space with respect to two resources. In this case, we'll say this is slope and elevation. Now currently, given that we've only estimated selection for slope and elevation for a single individual of each species, we will only have a single point in this niche space to represent each species. You can see now why this information is not that useful when looking for niche overlap. However, when we apply these analyses to each collared individual of mule deer for this example, we can visualize the ranges of selection of all collared mule deer for, again in this example, slope and elevation. When we apply these methods to each species, we can now visualize the overlap in selection, and therefore niche, between these three species with respect to these two resources. The overlap in these ranges represent the same information as in the one-dimensional niche plot. Also, we are able to quantify the degree of refuge niche space available for our native species. Now, to explain this concept briefly, in the worst case scenario, that niche overlap is present, competition is present, and that aoudad are the superior competitor, desert bighorn sheep will be unable to compete with aoudad for shared resources. However, if desert bighorn sheep are able to modify their behavior to only select resources that are not shared with aoudad, so I'm referencing this space right here for bighorn and this space right here for mule deer. If that was the case and they were able to do that, they would be able to maintain persistence in aoudad occupied landscapes by compressing their niche to minimize competition and the effects of competition with aoudad. If they were unable to do so, desert bighorn would fall victim to competitive exclusion and would slowly decline to regional extirpations in areas heavily occupied by aoudad. So, to finish this out, it is very important to identify the extent of available refuge niche space for both desert bighorn sheep and mule deer. Now, another useful method we will be employing is the projection of niche space onto the landscape. So that is where there's an overlap in niche space and where there is refuge niche space. When we apply these analyses to all individuals in the study, we will be able to provide population level assessments of where in this region of the Trans-Pecos we can expect the highest degree of competitive interactions between populations of these three species. Also, we're offered the opportunity to project refuge niche space onto the landscape. This will be useful in determining whether available refuge niche space is even intact enough to maintain desert bighorn sheep populations. Another very useful product of this method is that this map and at its foundations uses our habitat selection models to estimate where these two species are most likely to interact with each other. Therefore, from a disease perspective, and we're all aware of the MOV situation we're currently dealing with, this could highlight areas of increased probability of disease transmissions. And this, of course, could be very useful information on multiple fronts. Anyways, that's the extent of what I have prepared for you today. I am unfortunately unavailable for questions during the allotted time. However, my graduate advisors, Drs. Gonzalez and French, are available after this presentation to field any questions you may have. Thank you.